Welcome, everyone. I hope you are all having a wonderful morning so far. Today, we'll be having a webinar titled Prepping Like a Pro, Setting the Stage for the Great Learning Experience. My name is Dr. Anwar Hijaz, and I'm a political scientist faculty at Saddleback College, and I'm also a faculty mentor for CVC at One. I'm so pleased to introduce our facilitator for today's webinar, Dr. Bill Moseley. Dr. Bill Moseley has more than 27 years of experience in higher education, and he brings a deep expertise in educational leadership, innovation, and digital strategy. He has served in a variety of leadership roles, including Vice President of Innovation, Dean of Academic Technology, Faculty Director of Technology and Innovation and Professional Development, and a Faculty Chair for Computer Science. In addition, he's a longtime computer science professor with over 2 decades of classroom and online teaching experience. Dr. Moseley also spent 20 years as an adjunct faculty member in Pepperdine University's pioneering Learning Technologies graduate program. So before we get started, I just had a few announcements. During the webinar, we will share a survey link for your feedback. We really appreciate if you can fill out the short survey. This really helps the CVC improve and design programming that better meets the needs of the system. So we really appreciate your time in completing that. And lastly, while At One provides badges for course completion, we do not offer badging for attending this webinar. However, if your institution requires proof of attendance for flex credit or professional advancement, please stay until the end, complete the survey, and request a copy of your responses via the Google form. This confirmation can serve as proof for your attendance. With that, I will go ahead and give it to you, Bill, Dr. Bill.
All right, thank you so much. And you can hear me okay?
I hear you great.
Great. It's always good before I launch into something if I actually check and see if people can hear me just fine. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I see at least a familiar name or two here in the list of attendees, so I appreciate the support. It's good to see everybody virtually showing up today. I want to talk today about how great professors prepare. First, I'm going to give you some background information and sort of set it up, and then we'll get straight into the meat of things. So first, a little bit about me. As you heard in the announcement or in the introduction, I've been at Bakersfield College for over 27 years. I've worked in technical capacity. I've spent about 6 years in administration, and I am back in the classroom now and really enjoying my time there as well. And I also spent about 20 years at Pepperdine as an adjunct faculty, very involved in their grad programs in learning technologies. Some of those were absolutely groundbreaking programs, and I was really thrilled to be a part of those as well. As far as my education goes, I have a bachelor's in psych from Fresno Pacific University. I was actually a Bakersfield College student, so I was a community college student when I first graduated high school. And I moved on and transferred and got my bachelor's degree. I got a master's degree in educational technology, and my doctorate is in educational leadership. All that to say, I teach computer science, which is kind of an interesting situation, but I've taught computer science for a total of about 21 years or 20-ish years full-time at Bakersfield College. And I love all things technology, of course, and a huge nerd at heart. So my experience, my skill set is kind of weird and varied, ranging from leadership to curriculum development to learning theory, which is what I specialized in at Pepperdine, and distributed learning environments, and also, of course, computer science and coding and all of that fun stuff that goes along with that. So I've got an interesting profile, I think, as an educator. If you want to learn more about me personally or professionally, my website's bmoseley.com. Learningunderground.com is my consulting website. So I'll put the links back up to those later. But the most important thing that you should know about me is, and the thing that I'm most passionate about in life, is this group of people here. This is my family. This is us at my son's wedding, which was in Seattle not too long ago, just a couple of months ago. And this is the group of people that literally inspire most of my thinking and most of my desire to be a great educator. You can see we're a pretty diverse bunch, and we've got folks from different countries and all kinds of different backgrounds in our family. Um, it has been a real learning experience for me, coming from my own limited perspective and introducing all of these different ideas and ways of thinking about things to my family. And it certainly has challenged me and helped me to grow as an educator. So this seminar is an outgrowth of a project that I've been working on for a while now, and it's represents sort of a slice of this book, which the working title, of course, is "You're a Terrible Professor, and Sometimes So Am I," in which I really take a look at kind of the worst behaviors that I've seen in my 27 years, and I've worked with faculty extensively. I've been a faculty, of course. I've had conversation after conversation with colleagues about the best way to learn and teach, and everything from testing to anti-plagiarism software has been on our conversation list. And as I sort of gathered all of that information, it sort of became this passion project of mine, where I am taking a look at what the best professors do, but in the context of some of the worst behaviors I've seen out there. So it's a little tongue in cheek, I realize, but that's kind of just how I roll. So how I'm looking at this topic is sort of like this. If you think of this bucket of water as an individual student's sort of learning success, right? They start out with a full bucket at the beginning of the semester, and their job is to carry that bucket with them through the semester and hopefully reach the end of the semester with as much of that water in there as possible, enabling them to successfully complete the learning objectives of the course. Except for our students in the community colleges, the bucket often looks like this, right? The bucket has holes in it. And sort of the way I think about some of those holes is, first of all, there's a lot of things that you can't control. I mean, if you pay attention to the chancellor's office daily emails of headlines that are relevant to us, you'll see the first headlines for this morning's email was that our students, more than any other population, lack basic needs. So that's definitely a hole in the bucket, right? It's a big hole in the bucket. You'll see that I'm sure if you've spent any time with our students, what you know is our students are caretakers. They are working multiple jobs. They have kids. They have elderly parents. They have relatives that they have to go visit that live far away sometimes. And there are many, many other things. And those things are things that we can't control. Unfortunately, that hole is always going to be there. In some ways, we can help with that at a systemic level. But in the classroom, that's not really something we can control, not so much. Another hole is pedagogy. Pedagogy is a big one. And unfortunately, in higher education, we have a really bad habit of just sort of throwing people in the deep end. We say, okay, you have a bachelor's and a master's and a doctorate in biology. Let's put you in the classroom. But let's do that without ever teaching you anything about how to teach effectively. So that's a problem. And again, that's a systemic problem in higher education, but it's one that's more easily remedied at a classroom level. I'm going to talk a little bit about pedagogy, but I'm not going to go deep down that rabbit hole today because we simply don't have time, and you came for a preparation seminar. So communication is another hole in the bucket that I've identified in terms of faculty habits and behaviors that maybe hurt learning success. Preparation, how we prepare and sometimes how we don't prepare is another one. So we'll talk about that today. A relationship with students is another one. And systems, systemic things that as faculty, maybe we can do some things about, but not immediately, not in the classroom, more at a involvement level, I would say. Things like the Carnegie unit, things like grades. There are lots of systems out there, and many of them are well-intentioned and have a reason for existence, but have the unfortunate side effect of making learning in the classroom more difficult. So that's sort of the ecology of what I'm doing with the bigger project. And today, of course, we're going to focus on preparation. Before I jump into that, I do want to address what always seems to be the elephant in the room these days, and that is AI use. I would probably classify myself as pro AI. In other words, I don't think it's out to get us, and I do use it. And I do, in fact, welcome student use in my classroom. And I'm happy to talk about that. But we're not really here to learn about AI. I just want to address it because it's sort of on everybody's mind right now. And for what it's worth, I think some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are things that can be effectively used to address some concerns about student use of AI in the classroom. That is a big topic as well. But I will say a few things about AI use. Number one, I think of AI as a really good thought partner. In other words, it's a way for me to brainstorm and process things with conversation. AI excels at really well-defined tasks, where I maybe give it information and ask it to process it a certain way using very good parameters. AI can certainly shorten repetitive work. That's something I use it for a lot. AI excels at synthesis, analysis, and review. In other words, I can throw it a handful of research papers and ask it to pull the data from the research papers and synthesize it for me. That's a viable use of AI, and the reliability there is very, 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 very high. So those are some ways that I use it. But finally, I will say this. I believe that AI is best in the hands of experts. And I don't mean experts in AI. I mean experts in the subject matter that you're using the AI to work with. As you probably know, AI has a really bad habit of what is called hallucination. And it's called hallucination specifically because the AI actually believes that it's telling you something that's true when it is in fact telling you something that is not true. And so, I've had arguments with AI chatbots about whether what it said was true or not. And sometimes it defends itself, and sometimes it says, no, you're right. I don't know what I was thinking. I just made that up or whatever. And then it'll say the same thing again. So it's really kind of wild in terms of what it does and how it works. But if you understand how it works a little bit and you understand your subject matter, for example, I tell my students that using an AI engine to do their homework in my coding classes is sort of like getting behind the wheel of a 747 without knowing how to code or without knowing how to drive the plane, right? If you don't have any experience or instruction in flying a 747, you've probably seen enough on TV or whatever. You can get behind the wheel. You can maybe taxi down the runway. If you're really, really good at guessing, you might be able to get that thing off the ground. But at some point, because you won't know when it starts to hallucinate with the code that it's writing for you, you will reach a level of complexity that is sort of like being up in the air in that 747 and not having a clue what to do. Not only will you be stuck, but you'll kind of be in trouble because it's difficult to back your way out of that. And so having that conversation with students is part of my class. It's part of my syllabus. It's part of my introduction to AI. But I'm a firm believer that subject matter expertise is still very important when you work with AI. It allows you to be an experienced pilot and fly that plane well, and hopefully land it safely. So, as part of the framing of this, I have to talk about pedagogy because pedagogy is woven throughout all of what I do. And pedagogy, I would define as a few areas. I would include the learning model, and this is a lot of what people typically, traditionally consider pedagogy. It's how we think about teaching and learning, or how we believe people learn, because that influences how we put information out there, how we structure our courses, how we approach the teaching. And pedagogy is definitely that. I would also say grading. You might substitute evaluations. You might substitute assessment. You might say this is the summative assessment. How you think about grading in relation to student learning and it's in relation to your course is definitely part of your pedagogy. I would say feedback, or what some people call formative assessment, is part of your pedagogy. How do you guide students along the way as they're learning? Okay, feedback is important. And finally, I would say pedagogy includes the tools of teaching, everything from the whiteboard to Canvas to everything in between. And so those are kind of the four things that I think about and would include in pedagogy as a model. Okay, so as I talk about the learning model, this is the learning model that I typically operate from. And I know it's complex and we're not going to go deep. We're not going to cover every piece of this, but I want you to pay attention to the three names that are at the nucleus of this model: Papert, Piaget, Vygotsky. What the three of them collectively have developed is a branch of learning that basically says people learn by doing real stuff and sharing it with other people. And so that's sort of the core of my learning model. Now, of course, I deal with cognitive load theory. There's a little bit connectivism, situated learning, experiential learning, authentic learning. Those are all parts of this. So if I'm going to distill this learning model down into a framework that's pretty simple, I would say that great learning is personal, where the student can say, this learning is connected to me, right? When the student is learning, this feels connected to who I am and what I care about. Great learning is authentic. In other words, what I'm doing as a student feels real and meaningful to me while I'm doing it. Authentic learning is sort of the antidote to the idea of this student sitting in a high school geometry class and learning the Pythagorean theorem and saying, when am I ever going to use this? Right? We've all heard that before. But authenticity is sort of the opposite, where it says, I feel like this is meaningful. I feel like what I'm doing is real. Great learning is creative. And creative is a term that has been sort of sidetracked by the arts. And creativity is so much bigger than art, and so much bigger than music, and so much bigger than the things that we typically think of as creative vocations. Simply put, a creative learning experience is where the learner is able to express themselves as part of the learning. And they can put some of themselves into it. By the way, side note, this is a massive cheating reducer, all of these things. Personal, authentic, creative, every one of those is negatively correlated with cheating behaviors if you're inclined to worry about that stuff. Great learning is active. I am a real participant in this learning. In other words, this is not something that's happening to me or at me. I'm a real participant in what we're doing. Great learning is social. I'm sharing my learning with others. Some learning theorists, like Vygotsky, would say that learning actually happens in the act of sharing. I don't know when learning actually happens, but I do firmly believe that sharing your learning with other people is a huge part of the process. Great learning is reflective. I'm thinking about my own learning. Okay, some people call this metacognition. Other people just call it reflection, but I'm thinking about what I'm learning. I'm taking a minute. I'm being directed to think about my own learning. And finally, great learning is structured for success. This learning makes sense to me. And we're really going to get into structure a little bit here today, because that is definitely part of preparation and it's an important part. Okay, so there's the foundation. Let's get into building the house here. Preparation as a aspect of being a great teacher. So the first thing I feel like it's a little bit of a bummer that I actually have to say this, but the first thing is just do it. If you're not preparing well for your classes, if you're sort of checking it out the day before and flying by the seat of your pants, then as my book will say, you might be a terrible professor. Here is a real quote. I'm going to set this up. A real quote sent to my daughter. I won't say which one because I'm not going to out anybody here. I won't say which class or anything like that, but I will say this. It was a late start class, which means it was an 8-week class instead of 16. It was in the second half of the semester. The teacher was assigned the class when my daughter registered for it. So before the beginning of the semester, which means they had the first half of the semester to prepare. And presumably they were teaching other sections of the same course. So here we go. Hello, I expect to have your Canvas for week 1 completed within the next few hours. Currently, the syllabus is still out of date, so I have some work to do, and Canvas is not being very responsive. So this was received at the end of the first week of the class, not at the beginning, not the week before, at the end of the first week of class, which means of the 8 weeks of class, which represented 16 weeks, the first week had already gone by. and I'm sorry, but the blaming of Canvas, I'm not a hardcore Canvas fan. Canvas is the tool we have. It's good, but we can't blame Canvas. Canvas was doing fine that day. My daughter was able to log in. Other students were able to log in. I was able to log in. So I can verify that Canvas was not being unresponsive. And so that's kind of a cop-out to blame Canvas. So as a mentor of mine once said to me, early is on time is late, and late is inexcusable. When it comes to preparation, this is sort of my mantra. We really want to be prepared early, not just on time. So the problem is most of us, when we go to teach a class, aren't adequately prepared. And what I mean by that is that maybe the structure of the class doesn't make sense to students. Your pacing and workload are ineffective. Your dates keep shifting throughout the class. Your standards keep shifting throughout the class. And maybe you're one of your excuses, or one of the things that you say is that I really like my class to be responsive. Maybe like you feel like you're the Jackson Pollock of teaching, and that you're just out there throwing the paint wherever you feel like it, and you're just going with your gut, and that's your gift as a teacher. I would say no to that. That is not what that's not what responsive should look like. So I actually talk about this myth, or this mythology of the responsive teacher, and I can show you how to prepare for responsiveness. And of course, finally, maybe you just didn't do it at all. So these are some ways in which we could be inadequately prepared. And so I'm gonna dig a little deeper into each one of these. So the first one, structure. Okay, so structure. Here's some questions that you might want to consider. First, I would always recommend starting with this. always start with the SLOs. The SLOs, at least as I understand SLOs, and I hope I understand SLOs, the student learning outcomes for my course should be the North Star for what I do in that course. Those things should be the central pieces of this. Isn't that why we put them on the syllabus? Isn't that why we are required to do assessment by accreditation? Those are the things that we should be focused on. The rest of the course should wrap around those. And so if you are putting together your whole course, maybe based on something else, and then also assessing for SLOs, I would say you're doing it backwards. So let's start with the SLOs. Let's look at the learning objectives if you have both, which you probably do. But look at the SLOs, look at the objectives. And then the second question I would say is, what can I reasonably expect students to know? I hear a lot of this from colleagues. I know we've had a lot of legislation in the last decade that has radically shifted what we can expect students to know in certain subject areas as they come into our courses. But this is an important question, because if you don't understand what you can reasonably expect students to know, and granted, there's a huge variation in what students will actually know, but we've kind of have to play the odds. Like, honestly, we have to think about what we can expect students to know, and maybe reach a little bit lower on that scale, so we're not leaving too many people behind. It's better for people to be a little bored at the beginning than get left behind at the beginning, I think. That's just me, though. So what can I expect them to know? That determines sort of the starting point and the scope and the range of what you need to do. And if there's any sort of specific remediation that you need to make sure happens, that guides that as well. So what can I expect students to know? Are there requirements of my course in the curriculum that don't seem to fit? There almost always are, unless you designed the curriculum yourself. And even in those cases, I've designed a curriculum, and I've gone a few years down the road and looked back and thought, why on earth was that included? It's important to understand that maybe there's a great structure in that class somewhere and a couple of weird outliers. And that's okay. You can still have a great structural element to that class and deal with the outliers. But maybe those outliers are there for a reason. For example, maybe you're teaching a welding course, and the course entails teaching students about the 20 different kinds of welding joins or whatever. I don't know anything about welding, so I'm totally making this up. And maybe as part of that course, they have to do a unit where they pass some kind of a safety test or safety inspection. And that doesn't really fit with the structural whole of the course where we're teaching about welding and the act of welding, but it's a requirement that needs to be taken care of. That's probably a requirement that you would want to put up front. I'm just guessing. But in the total scope of things, you want to think about what are the requirements that don't fit the main structure, and what's the best way to deal with those. And then the question I'm always asking myself, and we'll get to this when we talk about the responsiveness myth, is how does structure and flexibility work together? And I can assure you they do. So how do we think about structure? I'm just going to throw you some structural prompts, because so many people think that there's just a few ways to structure a course, when in fact there are so many great ways. And these are just individual pieces. I'd love to challenge you to think about how you could combine some of these models or prompts to create something really interesting. But here are some different models, okay? Moving from simple to complex. This is very common model. Concrete to abstract, foundational to applied. And some of these will make no sense for you given your subject matter, and some of you will be saying, oh, that's interesting. Spiraling back to key ideas and adding depth to those ideas. So in other words, covering things covering them again, covering them again. I like to think about this. I don't know if you're on social media at all, but some of the things that hook my attention the most are baking videos. I love a good cake decorating video where they get the cake spinning and then they just sort of smooth out the frosting and then they add layers and decorations and things. That's sort of how I like to think about these spiraling this spiraling idea is you know, if you're decorating a cake, you want to put the first layer of frosting on and then smooth it out and make it all perfect, and then you add some details, and you know, but it's just going around revisiting those same things but in a different way. Using previous assignments as building blocks for later assignments. As a programming teacher, this is something I use gratuitously, and sometimes you have multiple building blocks that seem unrelated at first, and then those will stack up into something. So you want to think about the progression of learning in your course. You want to think about prerequisite units that need to be covered before later ones. Things like that are important to think about. A chronological sequence. I think there are some subjects that where chronological sequence, it makes a lot of sense. A logical progression, a functional sequence. In other words, how does something function, whether it's a machine or an entity, following a process, a manufacturing process or any other process. Using steps to solve a bigger problem. Okay, so a specific methodology or a framework for problem solving. Case studies are great. Narrative is fun. If you want to capture people's imagination, a narrative is always so much fun. And the investigation of a mystery or a phenomenon using the subject matter as the basis for that. These are all so great. And if you can combine them in interesting ways, it really provides you with some fodder for some very creative teaching. What I would say when you're considering structure for your course is, please don't just use the textbook's table of contents as your course outline. I will say it. Sorry. Textbooks have a specific purpose for existence. Textbooks have a specific way of looking at things, a specific way of treating knowledge, and that is not going to be the best way to teach a course. Sorry, not sorry. Anyway, so pacing. Let's get into pacing. And in pacing, in the world of pacing, I really want to emphasize two concepts. One's called cognitive load. One's called cognitive fatigue. They seem similar. They are somewhat related, or there's some overlap there. But when I say cognitive load, basically, I want you to think about maybe a small coffee table. And I want you to think about how many different things you could put on that small coffee table before things start falling off. Okay, so that coffee table is like our brain. Okay, and our ability to contain things in short-term memory, which is required for conversion to long-term memory, is like a little coffee table. And it's really not a big coffee table, unfortunately. And as we put too many things on that coffee table at once, things start to fall off. And that's a human limitation. Trying harder has nothing to do with it. Okay, so in terms of our courses, we need to think about that. Cognitive fatigue is sort of a relative of what you might call adrenal fatigue, which I recognize is more of a popular concept than a medical term. But fatigue happens when you're doing too much for too long without rest. And so if you can imagine this coffee table just sort of being constantly loaded with things and things falling off of it for a longer period of time, the result there may be cognitive fatigue. Cognitive fatigue results in demonstrated performance diminishing. It results in lower conversion to long-term memory. It results in all kinds of things that we don't want our students to experience. So pacing is important. Remember this first. Again, apologies, but your class is not the only class. I know it's the most important class while you're teaching that class, but most of our students are taking a lot of classes and caring for relatives and their kids and working two jobs and. So in terms of cognitive load, pretending like our class is not the only class is a little bit damaging, I think, to students. So just something to be aware of. In terms of how this looks in terms of preparation and planning, I would think about timing of peaks and valleys in terms of cognitive load in relation to other classes. Think about this. When are students the most stressed in the semester? Right? There's 3 times I'm thinking of: beginning, middle, and end. Why? Because those are the times when they're freaking out about getting to class, figuring out their class schedule, getting in the right classes. They're thinking about midterms, they're thinking about finals. So in terms of my classes, I don't need to have anything timed at the middle or end of my class that's particularly scary. So I don't. It's just my little contribution to the well-being of my students. But you can think about that. How can we create balance, not just for our students in the whole, but also in our own course? How can we create balance? I like to think of the cognitive load in terms of a chart because I'm kind of a visual person. So if I were to chart the cognitive load of my class, it might look something like this. And I think this is really sort of the ideal goal. If your class resembles a heartbeat, or maybe you got a big assignment and a little assignment and then a rest and a big assignment, a little, you know what I mean? It doesn't really have to be big, huge, high stakes things. If your chart looks like this, then I pity your students because that's not good for learning. That's not supported by theory. It's not supported by research, but it's supported by tradition, isn't it? We have the midterm and the final, and maybe some little bumps here in between. Maybe we have a term paper. I don't know. But if your cognitive load looks like this, if you chart it week by week throughout your class, and it looks like this, maybe think about pacing, think about redistributing that learning or those high stakes activities a little bit better. You'll notice in my class, the heartbeat model, I don't really have any massive stakes assignments. Why? Because I don't see the need for that in terms of learning. But your class may have a different need, and that's fine. There may be needs to be some high stakes things throughout that class, but I sure bet we can distribute them in a healthier way. So preparation, once you have your model in place and you've sort of established your pacing, the next thing I would look at is setting dates, right? Here are 2 facts. Your course content is established before you ever put pencil to paper. The things that you have to cover for that course are relatively static. You can tweak things a little bit. You can decide how deep to go and that sort of thing, but the scope of your course is established by the curriculum. Your time that you have to teach the class is established. It's a 16-week course or whatever that is 3 units, and therefore you have this amount of time each week to teach that class. That's what we tell students. That's what's advertised. That's what they're buying when they pay tuition. That's what they're signing up for. And so, therefore, you should be able to, at the beginning of your course, unless it's the first time you ever teach that course, and then I would say there's a room for a little bit of iteration there, because we don't necessarily know how long something is going to take very well at the beginning. We can sort of estimate, and I would say after you've taught the class a time or two, you should know exactly what you're going to be covering. And you should be able to share that with students. I think it's critically important. So I would suggest communicating everything. I have a calendar online connected to my syllabus inside Canvas that students have access to from day zero that says exactly what I'm going to lecture on, exactly when things are due every single day for the whole semester. So they know exactly what's going to happen. We have the ability to do that because, again, the course content is established, the time we have is established. After we have a little bit of experience, we should know what we need to know in order to really communicate thoroughly. This reduces our students' cognitive load because if they know, then they can plan. And I don't know many students who don't want to know what's coming up. I don't think there are good surprises. Likewise, I highly recommend that you set your standards in advance. Okay. Establish and communicate criteria. How will things be graded at a very detailed level? What's important to you? Use rubrics. Please do not change the criteria midstream. Change it between semesters if you need to. If you find that last semester this didn't really work out or didn't communicate what I wanted or didn't elicit the kind of learning that I'd hoped for, yes, absolutely change your criteria between semesters. But in the middle of the semester, it's like this poor kid with the carrot attached to a pole. We don't want to do this to students where we're continually moving the finish line for them. They get enough of that elsewhere in life. They don't need it from us. And there's no instructional value in changing your criteria midstream. If your criteria doesn't work well, then fix it next time. But I would say actually use the criteria that you put out there. So establish it early, communicate it well, don't change it, actually use that for grading, actually use that for feedback. And if you've thought through your criteria well, then you're going to be able to do that effectively. Yes, we all make mistakes. So if you make an error, you put the wrong criteria or assign a weird amount of points or not enough points or too much points or whatever. If you make an error, I would say, whatever you do to fix that error, I hope you will think about how you can prioritize student success and well-being. I've seen too many instructors make a mistake, blame Canvas, and then try to cover it up and just tell students, we don't need to be gaslighting our students because we made a mistake. That's just sort of what it comes down to. Let's set our standards well and make sure that they're communicated and followed. So the responsiveness myth. I think that somebody saying that they don't like to over prepare for their class because they want to be responsive to what the students need sounds noble and is kind of a load of crap. So I think there are other ways to be responsive, and I encourage you to be responsive, but let's talk about that. So here's one way you can be responsive. You can allow students to work ahead. Maybe. It depends on how you structure your class. It depends on what you have for them to do. But I would say consider this as a possible option for responsiveness. If you want to allow students to work ahead and have more control over their own destiny, that's a nice way to be responsive. All of my projects in my classes, every one of them, low stakes or high stakes, has what I would call an extra challenge. And so I create the main learning challenge that covers the basic core of what I want them to learn in that unit. And then I say, if you want to have an extra challenge, or if you want to take this a little bit further and learn a little bit more, here's another challenge that you can tackle. I can tell you that at least 20% of my students try the extra challenges. It is not always the top students who try the extra challenges, interestingly enough. And I can also tell you that I do not give extra credit for extra challenges, period. I don't do extra credit in my classes anyway. It's sort of an issue that I have, but that's a different conversation. I provide them extra challenges, and I say these are to help you learn more if you want it. And I can tell you about 20% of my students do actually do the extra challenges. And if they do the extra challenges and they submit the extra challenge, or if they have a question, I respond to those things and provide feedback as if it was part of the core learning activity. And that's just my way of honoring their interest in going a little bit further. But I have found that students consistently like and appreciate the extra challenges. I am a big believer, because learning is social, that sharing and peer-to-peer work should be facilitated by me. If it's an online class, it's the law, right? It's the law. It's an accreditation requirement. Facilitate sharing, peer-to-peer work, actual meaningful interaction between students. For me, it's students sharing ideas about coding or approaches to problem solving, and it's fantastic the level of interaction that my students provide in those venues. And in a face-to-face classroom, and if I'm sitting in a computer lab, sometimes I'll tell all of my students to stand up and walk around the lab during a project and look at what their peers are working on. And I encourage people sitting next to each other to share ideas and talk to each other. I don't think of that as cheating. I think of that as a very real world approach to problem solving. Because when they get out there in the real world and they're creating software as a professional, they're not going to have to sit by themselves in a room and not talk to anybody. I guess they could choose that, but the vast majority of people programming software right now are working in teams anyway. So that's a valuable skill in and of itself. I try to provide learning and activities in multiple modalities, and that could mean posting something in a written form and as a video if I'm sharing information with them. It could mean allowing students to work in multiple modalities. For example, if I wanted a student to create a piece of software, I might allow them to submit their code to me with a written explanation of what the software does. Or I might allow them to create a video in which they capture the software in action and walk me through their code verbally. And I have students that consistently take advantage of both of those modalities. So multiple modalities allows you to be responsive in a different way to students. And for students that need extra help, right? The extra challenges sort of take it from the norm up. And if you have students that need extra help or remediation, I would like to throw this term at you. Responsive scaffolding is scaffolding or activities that are optional, but allow students to fill in gaps that they might have or move themselves into the zone where they can actually do the work. So that's another that you can really work on both sides of that problem. You can't do that if you're not prepared, by the way. This is not like you wake up in the morning of your lecture and just dream this up. You really have to spend some time thinking about the structure of your course and the structure of everything to do this stuff, but it's very, very effective. It's proven to be effective. And I would say, can you build in grace at an individual level? In other words, is there room in your course, in the way that you're teaching, for a student who has a reason to take longer or to move faster or to do something in a different way? Can you build in grace at an individual level? You can't do that if you're not prepared. Sorry. The only way to do these things effectively and fairly and in a real way are to be prepared. So responsiveness isn't about flying by the seat of your pants or just sort of feeling your way through the class. It's about being prepared and then using that preparedness as a platform for making the course meaningful and individualized for students. So some of the ways that I use AI for my own prep work, just some tactical things. I'm going to buzz through these. I say I have 10 minutes left, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I use AI to review my class coverage for completeness, making sure that everything is aligned, textbooks, assignments, things like that, that I'm not leaving things out. AI is perfectly capable of ingesting all of the material I use for my class. I use OEI materials for my classes, which means I can feed those to the AI and allow it to review all of that stuff. And I can ask it questions like, did I forget anything in this module? Did I explain this thoroughly? Things like that. AI is really fun to brainstorm structure with. Here's my class. Can you think of 5 different structural ways that I can approach this? The pace and the workload of my course is another way you can give that course outline or the outline of assignments and due dates to AI, and you can say, let's look at the pace that I'm using here. Is this too much work? Is there a point in the class in which students would be overloaded? It can assist with rubric development. If you're new at rubrics and you want a little boost, AI does a great job of rubric development. If you describe the assignment and ask it to come up with a rubric that emphasizes these 3 aspects of learning, it'll get you 90% of the way there. If you want to learn how to plan units of instruction, individual units of instruction, this is the book that I would recommend above all others. It's called Understanding by Design. It's by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTeague. It covers authentic learning, authentic assessment, backwards design, which includes the steps of identifying results, determining acceptable evidence, and then planning learning experience. So it's really starting big and then going into the details. That's why it's called backwards design. But Wiggins and McTeague are recognized experts on what's called authentic learning and authentic assessment. It will absolutely help you to zero in on your SLOs and then work backwards from those into meaningful learning experiences. So it's a great book, and it's sort of a workbook format. So I think there's actually a workbook companion to it, but even the book itself is very applied and very hands-on. So really, really recommend that book, and I've been using it for years and years, but I have yet to see something that I like better. So that's a great way to plan your units of instruction. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. I know I'm a fast talker, but that it is what it is. I can't really fix that. So please, please, please connect with me. These are QR codes for my personal website, my consulting site. That's my Google Voice number. Feel free to text me anytime on that. And I'm going to see if I can pull up the chat here and see if I have any questions. Wendy, go back 2 slides quickly. Sorry. Let's see. I don't know the AI one. Okay. Thank you for responding. Let's see if I can go back here. Okay, so I'm still sharing. Let's see. There it is. That one. And I think the CVC folks actually sent the slides out. Is that right?
No, we will be posting them on the website, on the webinar website. That I'll share the link right now for future webinars as well that we will be having in the fall. But that's where they'll find the recording of this and the slides, the link. But you can share it here as well if you'd like.
Just share them like through the chat.
Yeah, if you want to share the link for them in the chat, that works. Or you can just, for after the meeting, share them with us, and we're going to be posting them on the website.
Yeah, I sent them to you guys, but if you need them again, I'll send them, and then you can post them to the website. Hopefully that'll work.
Sounds great.
And then I'm trying to see, were there any other questions?
No, I think it was mostly comments. There is one question right now. What is the best practice for integrating Kahoots or Think, Pair, Share in lecture?
I would say Kahoots and Think, Pair, Share are are nice, nice ways to just get people moving. I would say going back to the learning framework, right? You want to ask yourself, um, for the big stuff in your class, you want to think about how students can be authentic and how they can be creative, right? And Cahoots are responsive. It's basically a social flashcard game, right? We're just testing for knowledge. And when we stop thinking about knowledge or learning as putting things in a bucket, uh, and start thinking about knowledge as a shift in somebody's identity as a result of an active, authentic experience that they have, then we start to think about, okay, well, how can I provide those active, authentic experiences for students? Cahoots are fun. They get people moving. They get people energized. I'm not anti Kahoot. I just want to make sure that we are focusing on learning as an active, creative, social process instead, if that makes sense.
So thank you all so much for attending this webinar. Before you go, please check the chat for the survey and take a moment to complete it. You will receive a copy of your responses, which can serve as your verification for attendance. And of course, if you have any issues, you can contact support@cbc.edu for assistance. Also, please, check out the link that I dropped for the other webinars that we have coming up. And lastly, this webinar, the recordings and the associated slides will be available at the CBC at One website. Thank you all so much, and thank you so much, Dr. Bill, for this wonderful, wonderful webinar. I learned so much, and I was like, "Ooh, I need to work on that in my class." And we do have like a few minutes, so if anyone has a question, feel free to type it in the chat. But if not, have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
A lot of great thank yous. Awesome webinar in the comments. So thank you again. And I'll drop the link again for the survey in case anyone missed it. And I'll stop recording.